Welcome, Stuart Knechtle. It's a pleasure to have you here with us for the very first time. Thank you very much for accepting my invitation.
Edrei, it's a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on.
I wish it was a conversation, but because of my limitation in English, it will be more than like an interview. Okay?
Sounds good.
Okay. I appreciate your work with the youth, agnostics, atheists, to introduce Jesus to them and bring them back to God. Can you please tell more about you and your work?
Absolutely. So I am a pastor with my dad and my brother, actually, right outside of New York City. And so I do a lot of teaching, preaching, counseling. But then the ministry that you're talking about is called Give Me an Answer on YouTube. And it's a television show, too, around here. So it's an apologetics channel that's connected, a ministry that's connected to our church. And what we do is we go around big college campus universities that we get invited to by different student ministries. And then we just, it's not, I'm sure you've seen kind of the pretty wild John the Baptist type street preachers who are calling down kind of fire and brimstone. We're not exactly that type. We instead kind of enter into a dialogue where there's a discourse back and forth. It's kind of like Paul in Acts chapter 17. That's sort of our model, where he's going up against the Athenians, and there's a lot of debate, healthy debate, talking about worldviews. And so we do that with the students there on different college campuses. And sometimes the atheists and agnostics will be very angry, very upset that we're even there talking. Other times, though, and the majority of the time, actually, I'd say 90% of atheists and agnostics, and certainly the Christians, are very excited that we are there. And the atheists and agnostics do not like the content that we have to share. They do not like the gospel, but they are enjoying the freedom of speech, I guess, that they see, because in the US, freedom of speech has decreased some. So that's kind of some of it.
Fantastic biography. Now, tell me about your conversation and interview with atheists, science, famous like Peter Atkins. I saw a video of you with Peter Atkins, or Christian science like John Lennox. Tell about it, please.
Yeah. Well, first of all, that's pretty cool that you are so familiar with those guys. That's fantastic. I think most Christians and apologists here aren't as familiar as kind of as you're bringing them up, Edrei. So that's fantastic. Yeah, with Peter Atkins, he automatically, right off the bat, even though he's an Oxford chemist, very smart guy, you can tell in a conversation and kind of the debate that we had with him on YouTube there on Give Me an Answer, that he automatically writes off any idea of God as ridiculous. And so he's not coming into debates open-minded at all. Some atheists come in a little bit open-minded. And this gets into, is atheism a worldview like Christianity, or does atheism simply just mean I don't believe that there's any God? Or going to the extent of saying, I know that there is no God. Well, obviously, you can't prove that there is no God, and you can't prove that there is a God. And so for Peter Atkins, he kind of handles it in a very black and white sort of way, of just this incredible certainty that there is no God, and the whole idea of a God is just absolute foolishness. But then you have a guy like John Lennox, who I'm glad you brought up, and they've both debated many times. And talking to Lennox said Peter Atkins' worldview and his atheism and how he uses his science is actually pretty easy to debunk in some ways. And one of those ways is simply, I mean, everything that begins to exist has a cause. And obviously the universe began to exist, so there has to be a cause for the universe. And Peter Atkins is getting at process, not origin. Science gets at process, not origin. Origin is a philosophical question. And so John Lennox takes the next step, and he talks about how even during the scientific revolution, you had Kepler, Galileo, and so many who were saying, okay, there's a divine lawgiver, and so we can follow the laws to the lawgiver. Or there was other examples about there's a creator, and so he's given us creative minds, and that is what fuels our creativity. So it's an interesting dialogue. Obviously, two great scientists. John Lennox is probably more of a mathematician, and yet they really go after it. And I think Peter Atkins, even though I liked him a lot, he's probably not one of the more thoughtful atheists in terms of thinking through his science and how it applies to worldviews.
Taking advantage of this topic, could you tell us a little bit of your conversation with John Lennox about artificial intelligence and how the human brain proves the existence of a God? Please.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think his latest book on that is 1984, I want to say. And so he's kind of stealing that from Orwell. And I love where he's going in that book. I want to read the whole thing. But a lot of it has to do with bringing in questions, he says. And he talks about those questions being, what are human beings? Are we made in the image of God, or are we just a random collection of molecules? Are we a bag of chemicals? Do we have no real purpose? Do we just come about by chance? And so when he talks about artificial intelligence, if we take it too far, it could be used for tremendous evil in a way. And we see this obviously in different forms, eugenics in the past and others where science has not helped us. But he says there's also great potential for good as well with AI. But I just like how he really asks the hard questions when it comes to AI, in the sense of, if we are progressing, and we obviously are in this area, this is going to make us rethink what it even means to be human, and what are humans. And can robots even become humans? Can they have the same type of capacity? Now, I don't think they can, obviously, because of, say, things like consciousness and things like the human heart. I think God only gave humans human hearts. But Edrei, your good question on how the mind points to God, I think that gets at soul. Mind and soul are very close. They're synonyms in a way. And I think if any human being thinks long enough about just the brain, they're going to come to the conclusion that you're more than just a brain. There's something outside of the brain. Think about all of our communication of myself, yourself, ourselves. We're always talking about self, and we're always identifying with a reflective human being who has this type of consciousness. And Lennox goes on to talk about how even our thoughts don't make sense from a strictly materialistic perspective, where it's somehow you think through, like, you have the physical, you have neurons, you have different chemicals in your brain, and they're firing in some kind of way, and all of a sudden you get a thought. Well, a thought is not merely physical. How do you get to that point? And so there's so much immaterial, and that's why, Lennox will say that there's a mind behind it. And I'm sure you'll remember, Edrei, I'm sure you'll remember Christopher Hitchens, and how Christopher Hitchens, he went to his grave as a very angry atheist. And there's one illustration of him when he was being pushed along a gurney, when he was getting chemotherapy treatment for his cancer before he died. And someone turned to him, I think it was a doctor, turned to him at one point and said, "Hey, Chris Hitchens, you're not feeling very well." And he looked at the doctor and he said, "You mean just my body? There's no your." And so I think that gets to your question in terms of the mind versus the brain. We are more than just a brain. We are more than just a body. But you see that Christopher Hitchens is being consistent there, because he was an atheist and he only believed that there was his body, that there wasn't such a thing as a mind or a soul.
I know a great apologist, and I will give you a few names, and I want to tell me to tell me what you think about them. Okay?
Great.
William Lane Craig.
Yeah. What do I think about him? I think he's a great apologist. I like how he goes for the moral argument as well as the fine-tuning argument as his top two. And then he's done great work on the case for the resurrection being a historical fact. And so that he sticks to those three arguments as his favorite, and then he's done a lot more work in other areas, are really good. I would say the only potential negative with William Lane Craig is he stays so philosophical, and there's so much head knowledge there, which is great. You know, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. But the heart and the soul have to be there too. And so I gravitate more so typically. I use some of William Lane Craig, but I gravitate more towards others who don't just go with the classical arguments, but instead address the whole human being.
Okay. Number 2, Frank Turek.
Yeah, we just had Frank Turek on our show, actually. And that was a fun conversation.
I saw.
Oh, you saw that one? Okay. Yeah, I think Frank Turek he's loud. He's pretty funny. He is clear and concise. He's not a philosopher like William Lane Craig. What else would I say about him? I think we're similar.
He's theologian.
Sorry,
he's theologian.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, there's definitely there's some theological tendencies he has. But the reason why I also like him, and I use some of his stuff as well, is because what he's doing is very similar to what me and my dad do out on college campuses. We had a long talk about how, he's indoors and we're outside, and how, random people can just come up and start yelling at us when we're outdoors. But for him, it's a little bit more of a controlled setting. But I think he does a great job. He speaks with a lot of conviction. He brings in humor. They both have written books that are good. So,
Alistair McGrath.
I didn't think you were going to ask about him. That's a good one. Edrei, you know your apologist. That's impressive. Yeah, Alistair McGrath, he wins brownie points for his accent, but he's also very good at discussing meaning, purpose, and then bringing in science. And I think he's similar in some ways to John Lennox, obviously in Where They Live, but also he's got a good book on dismantling Dawkins, called The Dawkins Delusion, and I think it's some type of response. And so he does a good job. He's pretty philosophical too, but he speaks to the emotions as well, and doesn't really focus too much on the classical arguments, although he spends some time there. But I like that he addresses the whole human being. He's written probably one of the best biographies of C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis, you could say, is probably, if not the top apologist, one of, next to St. Augustine.
C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
20th century, but...
Yeah, that's another good one. So C.S. Lewis, I would say Mere Christianity, Problem of Pain, The Two on Suffering, The Great Divorce. I love the Screw Tape Letters that he wrote. I think that is, if you haven't read the Screw Tape Letters, that's one of my favorite, just showing how the devil works. And a lot of that's biblically based, and then other parts of it, he's kind of just doing more guesswork, but it's calculated in terms of what the Bible says about the devil. And so that's really helped me in thinking through temptation and avoiding temptation. And there's also an interesting part that C.S. Lewis talks about in Screw Tape Letters, where a demon says, so the head demon says to his understudy, make your client as busy as possible. And I don't know about, Brazil, I'm sure you guys live a very fast-paced, busy life. Over here in the U.S., it's a very fast-paced, busy life. And so what C.S. Lewis is trying to communicate there is that if we are too busy and we just dig into, in his book, he talks about his client reading the newspaper. For us, we probably don't read newspapers anymore. But we do read online, and We Instagram and do all of our social media. And so are we too busy to talk to God and to have a devotional life? And that's one of the devil's top ways of getting to us, distracting us away from God by keeping us busy. And so C.S. Lewis is another guy who did a great job I've been to his office there in the UK before, and he did a great job addressing the whole human being: head, heart, emotions, will, free will. And, what led him to the faith was J.R.R. Tolkien, through connecting with the imagination, through storytelling, through showing that narrative that we all want. We're chasing after eternity, something beyond, where loving relationships ultimately will remain, and that there is a good and evil. But the atheistic worldview can't speak to those things. So C.S. Lewis was an atheist, but he became a Christian because of those types of issues.
Okay. My last name for you is Lee Strobel. The case for Christ, the case for creation, the case for miracles. Lee Strobel.
Yeah, so he's friends with my dad. My dad and Lee are friends, and Lee has set up a big debate once for my dad, where he debated a guy who was trying to get under God out from under our Pledge of Allegiance. Lee's really good because he's similar to Frank Turek in a way, in the sense of he simplifies things, keeps it simple. He makes it applicable to people's lives. So it's easy to retain and memorize his content from his books and when he speaks. And I love his books, and I like Lee Strobel a lot because he speaks with great passion. I think he used to be a pretty good journalist, and so he's great at investigating. And I remember in his books, he typically starts out with telling the story about how he came to faith, and how Lee Strobel said he originally thought the Christian faith was a total joke. And he was going to go investigate it and prove to his wife and his friends that the Christian faith is just not true. It's a total joke. But the more he did, and I think he was writing for the Chicago Tribune maybe, the more he did, he realized, wow, there's a lot of evidence for Jesus Christ as a historical figure, that he died on a cross, that he rose from the dead. And then if you step back, God actually existing, and we humans having a free will, on and on, all of these different topics. And I like that he goes in his books and he talks to different experts in different fields and how they kind of work through these issues together.
I'm so sorry. My last name is not Lee Strobel. My last name is Cliff Knechtle.
Absolutely. My dad has been an excellent influence on my own kind of growth as an apologist. And I joined up with my dad about 5 years ago. And my dad has an approach similar to Frank Turek and Lee Strobel. He's probably in that type of category. But my dad is really, he'll really go after atheist agnostics in a pretty intense way at times. And a lot of Christians like that. Some Christians think perhaps they're a little more gentle in their approach. And I don't know, they're not turned off by it. They think it's good, but it's just not quite their style. And so my dad has that level of intensity. He was a basketball coach. He played college basketball. So he has that intensity. He doesn't back down. I think with my dad's style, even though the 1990s, it fit with the culture a little bit more than back then. But I think his style is really important today because a lot of Christians, when it comes to apologetics, we certainly are, like we read in 1 Peter, to remain humble. And obviously Jesus talking about how let your language be seasoned with salt, to be gentle and kind in all that we say. At the same time, when you're doing apologetics and you're going up against some really hard critics, it's important, like Paul in Athens and with the Jews, or like Jesus at times with the Romans, and definitely with the Pharisees, it's important sometimes to be pretty direct and not just mealy-mouthed and overly gentle and like a snowflake or overly sensitive and too quiet and reserved and shy. Instead, an apologist needs to at times be able to get out there, really debate, not with anger by any means, but real confidence from the Lord, and then also a level of intensity that can help push the debate forward. Good lift.
Okay, great. Now, questions about the importance of Christian apologetics. My first question is about Brazil. Since the turn of the century, we have seen a expansion of the culture of evangelicalism here. So our nation has already a culture of evangelicalism. But when our youth went to university and college, they kind of lose their faith in God, or it becomes weaker than before. How can apologetics help our youth to keep strong their faith in university?
Yeah, so here in the US, 75% of Christian high schoolers lose their faith in college. And that's because atheism runs rampant. It's very pervasive at the secular universities, these large universities that we have here in the US. And so it's interesting to hear you say that, Edrei, in Brazil too. Fascinatingly, though, which is a positive, of that 75%, at a minimum 40% come back to the faith later on in their lives. And there's this, do you guys know of Jordan Peterson? Have you heard that name?
Yeah.
So Jordan Peterson he's pretty big over here, and I'm sure he's probably made a pretty big impact in Brazil as well, really worldwide. He doesn't consider himself a Christian, but a lot of his themes and a lot of his talks have a lot of Christian themes to them that speak to especially college students, more so than any other demographic. And I noticed there were high school students at my church who lost their faith. When they went away to college, they started reading Jordan Peterson and listening to him. Came back and they were Christians. That's strange because Jordan Peterson is not a Christian. And yet he's getting at something when he talks about meaning, purpose in life, when he talks about Judeo-Christian values having really built this place, where he's talking about how we do gravitate towards something eternal. So Jordan Peterson, I think apologetics, I think of Jordan Peterson's message, even though, again, he's not Christian, a lot of his themes connect to apologetics in showing that there is eternity out there. There are these big questions like meaning and purpose and hope, and how do you deal with suffering that all need to be answered. And so I think for the typical college student, it's going to be very important to make the step of really thinking through your faith. I almost lost my faith my first year of college. I wouldn't say I was right at the doorstep there of turning away from Christ, but I had some pretty big doubts. And learning to doubt your doubts, and what I mean by doubt your doubts is simply, if I have a doubt, say, for example, why does God allow suffering? Well, if I have this doubt that's saying no good God should allow suffering, I'm playing God in a way. And how do I know that God wouldn't have good reasons to allow suffering? So that's a small example of how to doubt your doubts, rather than just to say, oh gosh, the God of the Old Testament judged in a pretty angry kind of way. I got to discount my faith now. So thinking through it deeper, that's kind of the counsel maybe I would give college students, where don't just grow up in your parents' Christian home and remain a Christian that way. It's fine if you do, that's okay, that's good. But especially with where the world is at now, learning to answer these hard questions after you've asked them is going to be important for your faith.
Okay. Excellent analysis. In this topic about our youth and these questions, Alistair McGrath, in his book, named in Portuguese, Christian Apologetics in the 21st Century, draws attention to the necessity of the defense of the faith against the claims of the modern world, the postmodern world. And here we're talking about feminism, the relecture of Marxism, for example. And many young people are won over by these ideas. How do you deal with the generation of rebels?
Rebels. I like that word. It's good. Yeah, the generation of rebels. That's a good way to put it, Edrei. I would say you start with asking them questions about, do you want, so one question that I ask these rebels on college campuses is, do you want there to be a judgment day? And so here in the US, because oftentimes I hear college students now say, I don't want there to be eternity. I don't want there to be a heaven. I just want my life here on earth, and then that's it. But I think if you turn that around in some sense and ask them, well, don't you want there to be a judgment day? Because here in the US, justice is huge right now in terms of talking about it. In terms of talking about, are the presidents acting justly? Are the politics in general, is it being handled in a just way, whether it's voting and the ballots or any other topic related? What about racism? And do especially blacks get justice right now? What about the Me Too movement? On and on and on. Asking a college student who is kind of the rebel like that, fine, you don't want eternity, but don't you want justice for those types of people who perhaps have been abused in some type of way, or a woman who's had a very abusive husband throughout life? And especially the worst case scenarios where there's been tremendous injustice done. Don't you want there to be a judgment day where all wrongs will be made right? And typically that'll get someone thinking, these rebels thinking, to the point of saying, okay, fine, I do want there to be some type of justice. And I know I don't, everything in me screams that this world is not right. And it's certainly not right if those who are in power, whether it's the Marxists or whoever it might be, win in the end and get away with all kinds of sin, all kinds of destruction. So they can at least get to the point of wanting there to be some type of justice and judgment day.
Here we have a Twitter of your project giving me answer that says, atheists believe in a virgin birth of the universe. Well, this is a criticism against the power of nothing, a fallacy of naturalistic atheism that brings us to the cosmological argument for the existence of God. What is the relevance of this argument in debate? And which is your favorite version of this argument?
For me, I think the cosmological argument is so helpful, especially right now, because scientists, if we go back again and we talk about origin and process, science is after process. So often I'll hear in the US something called scientism, and scientism is huge. And basically what scientism says is there's a hard scientism and a soft scientism. A hard scientism is basically the only type of truth you can ascertain is scientific. It has to be through science. A soft scientism is scientific truth is still number one truth. It's not the only truth, but it's the number one truth. And so everything is science here in the US. And I was on a train once with a woman who was a dentist, and she said, the idea of God's ridiculous. It's just science. And so we kind of went over the cosmological argument. And I talked to her about how, no, there's no science behind origin right now. We don't know. We have no idea, especially if the universe did have a beginning. And we know that Albert Einstein had to insert a fudge factor trying to show that the universe was eternal, because he knew that if people found out that it was finite, not eternal, then that would postulate that there have to be some type of God. And so everyone has pushed back against the idea of background noise also showing that the universe is not eternal. Because if you're going to get to the point of saying, okay, this place had a beginning, well, everything that has a beginning has a cause. And God is outside of space and time, so it's not an infinite regress. Instead, God created space and time himself. And those are philosophical issues. You can't get at it through science. And we know that atheists will posit, for example, the multiverse. Well, the multiverse, again, is it's such a stretch, because there's no evidence for anything like the multiverse and that theory. And it's, again, showing tremendous bias and a last-ditch effort for an atheist to try and say, oh, well, hold on. wait a second here. There's infinite amounts of universes, and somehow we just got lucky with one. Well, again, what is the evidence for it? We haven't seen any. Maybe there'll be some at some point in the future, but I highly doubt it. And so at this point, I think that's one of the really good arguments. If you were asking about another argument that I find tremendously helpful, I think the argument of beauty, the aesthetics. That's one of my favorite arguments that's not used very often. And the beauty argument basically talks about how we find things tremendously beautiful that evolution can't explain. Things that have to do with life, and then things that have to do with darkness. So, for example, a painting of a dark winter night where there's a full moon. It doesn't exactly have to do with life. It's more darkness. Or we like other forms of art that are bleak and darker as well. Or, for example, the Sahara Desert has nothing to do with life, because a lot of evolutionists would say, oh, we respect beauty because obviously, a beautiful sunset or a beautiful mountain range, that originally led our ancestors to higher ground or some type of fertile ground where you could find a way to get food. No, we know for a fact that can't answer, that evolutionary perspective can't answer it holistically. And then, so I would start there, and I would talk about also how we make beauty now into a moral issue. I'm sure you guys will remember when Notre Dame was on fire a couple years ago, and everyone treated it like it was such a moral, monstrous kind of issue, and there was a bunch of crying over it and weeping. How could this thing be on fire? And it wasn't so much for the religious connection of Notre Dame. It was more so just the beauty of it, and that people saw it as a moral issue that it was burning. And so we have this hunger and this thirst for beauty. So that points to God. And the reason why I like that argument is because you can take that argument for God, beauty and aesthetic, and bring right in Jesus Christ as the most beautiful being who's ever lived, and talk about the beauty of the cross. And Dostoevsky, when he was an atheist, walked in one time to a church and there was a crucifix, and he became a Christian because of the beauty of the cross. And you think Dostoevsky, okay, he's such a smart guy, one of the best writers of all time. And yet it wasn't so much thinking through all these arguments. Instead, it was looking at the beauty of Jesus sacrificing even for his enemies. That's what kind of led to his conversion. And so that's why I love the beauties, the intangibles, how these things connect with us emotionally. That helps me.
So what are the best basic arguments that we have, in your opinion, or disposal today?
Ask that one more time.
What are the best basic arguments that we have at our disposal today?
Oh, I see. Good question. Very good question. Best arguments that we have at our disposal today, in my mind, you still can go with the cosmological, the teleological, all the illogicals. All of those still work, but it depends on the culture. And that's why I liked you talking about your culture some. And right now, we live in a secular age here in the US. There's a lot of religious nons. There's an increase of men and women from the age, especially of their teens to 30, who are saying, I'm no longer religious. And by doing so, you're all of a sudden setting up apologists in such a way where they have to get creative and say, okay, how can I lead a person to first wanting God to be real and wanting Jesus to actually be God and the way, the truth, and the life? Because if you can't get them to the point of actually wanting and finding this beautiful and attractive, they're not going to listen to the rest of the classical arguments. They're not even going to want to take part in them. So starting off there with things like, okay, how does God change me? How does God help me grow out of say, depression or anxiety? How does God change my identity, give me a meaning, give me hope? How does God answer the tough question of evil and suffering? Because we're all going to experience suffering. And so you start there, and then you can go more so into these more classical arguments. Other ones would be the argument from desire, the argument from design, the argument from mathematics, the argument from simplicity. So there are many different arguments out there, and yet ultimately you got to introduce the person of Jesus Christ. And even if they start to find some of these arguments appealing, if they don't meet Christ, it's not going to really matter much. And so creating a picture for them that's helpful in terms of who Christ is, what was his character like, what were the claims that he made, and do you believe that then ultimately that he's the Son of God based off of his resurrection? Then those can flow nicely, but it's assessing the culture first, helping a person get to the point of wanting Jesus to actually exist and wanting God to obviously exist now, finding that attractive, and then listening to the logical points for why he does exist.
Thank you. My last question for you is, how do you deal with classic arguments, atheist arguments like the problem of evil, the disappearance of God, and evolution against creation?
Yeah. If there is no God, then evil shouldn't bother us very much. And one resource I would lead people to is the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek by Annie Dillard. And in there, she talks about how she went to a creek once behind her house, and she went out there almost every morning, kind of journaling what she would see. And she would see these insects being killed in just horrific sorts of ways, like one insect jumping on top of a frog's back and sucking its brains out. And she saw this, and it seemed very, very normal in that type of habitat. And so she got to the point of thinking, okay, either this type of what I consider evil and suffering and monstrosity, either there's something really bad to it and in it, or I need a lobotomy, and I'm a freak. I'm the weirdo. And what she was getting at was a similar illustration would be, if there were a couple gazelle grazing in Africa, and one lion came up, and let's just say two of those gazelle, let's say there were two sisters, so we'll say there's two sisters, one brother. One of the sisters gets picked off by a lion. Well, the other two are going to lift their heads up and watch the sister get killed, and then go back down to grazing grass. And so in the animal kingdom, you don't see, you can make exceptions, I guess, with dolphins sometimes, but typically in the animal kingdom, we're not going to prosecute a lion for killing a gazelle, and the gazelle are not going to be overly frustrated. And so from a humanistic understanding of things, and I don't mean humanism, I just mean as human beings, we know that there is tremendous evil, there is suffering, and it really bothers us for a reason. And that shows that there's a moral law written on our hearts, and that there's really a way that life is supposed to go. And so I would start there, and then I would go to the cross and talk about how Jesus makes sense of suffering and how he suffers with us and how he's ultimately evil will be done away with. And then your question on your second one was, evolution. I think evolution fits nicely with the Christian worldview. I think the only time you get in trouble with evolution is if, say, a creationist, for example, if you become too literal in your interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2. And then you find contradictions if you become too literal, at least in my mind. And if you start doing things, for example, because my creationist friends always are very much against evolution. And if you become too wooden in your interpretation of, say, for example, genealogies, and you're counting up and then counting back and saying this is how old the earth is.
William Lane Craig is very good in it.
What's that?
William Lane Craig is very good in evolution versus creation in the Genesis 1 to 11.
Yes.
genealogies.
And I think William Lane Craig, that's a great point, Edrei. And William Lane Craig says that, that could be. The Bible doesn't directly speak against that, but microevolution in terms of natural, the different types of adaptations going on that will help survive. I don't see that some way contradicting the Bible.
Thank you very much for accepting my invitation. Thank you very much by interview. God bless you so much. I'm very happy that you have been with us. God bless you.
Elizeu, thank you guys so much for the invite, and I really enjoyed being with you. God bless you, and keep going. Keep doing a great job with the ministry. So important.